Hi, I'm Sameer Jain. Earlier, I had suggested that we have a constitutional amendment permitting naturalized citizens to run for the office of the President of the US. Today, I want to take this discussion in a different direction and go beyond headline news. Touch upon things like limited government, representative government, federalism, civil liberties, our civil rights, Congress and constituency, Congress and the party, domestic policy, foreign policy, federal bureaucracy, so that all of these come together in a vibrant public discourse. So I'm going to create a lens through which to perceive a lot that we see that's happening around us. But let's get the elephant out of the room. First, let's be clear, and this is what a lot of folks outside the United States don't understand, is that our presidents operate within a system of divided power. Although they routinely propose legislative initiatives, it is Congress that has lawmaking power. So as a result, a president's ability to get things done depends largely on Congress's willingness to respond. An exception, of course, are executive orders, which are issued by the president through constitutional authority as chief executive. So presidential success in the area of domestic policy is driven by the partisan makeup of Congress, really whether a majority of its members are from the president's party or not. Outside domestic, in foreign policy, they have a lot more clout. So, although an oversimplification perhaps, presidents are less constrained in the foreign policy realm than in the domestic policy area. Although, for example, the Constitution assigns Congress the power to declare war, the decision to send troops into hostile action in practice rests with the president. A president has comparative advantages here. For instance, control over information in the making of foreign policy, as well as a bunch of other areas. Also, a president has temporary war power. Unlike other policy areas, foreign policy, and that's why it is called foreign, rests on relationship with actors outside rather than within the country. As a result, the chief instruments of foreign policy of course, differ from those of domestic policy, diplomacy, military power, though of course these days they get muddled often. These days it's also about international trade, the fact that international security is increasingly more than an issue of military might and a question of maintaining a strong position in the global economy. But let's not get stuck on just one aspect, the president or the presidency. That's high visibility. Something we often overlook is federal bureaucracy. The bureaucracy has no constitutional authority of its own, of course. It is staffed by unelected officials. Its authority derives from constitutional powers granted to the executive, legislative, judicial branches. Yet, the federal bureaucracy exercises power of its own as a result of its role in implementing policy decisions. If you've seen the BBC serial Yes Minister, you would know what I mean. Moreover, federal agencies have an agency point of view. They seek to promote their programs and the resources that enable them to succeed in this effort. So, figuring out the role of bureaucracy, its structure, staffing, operation, as well as the challenge of holding the bureaucracy accountable for its actions is important too. To even get to the bottom of issues, we need to be aware that the US is, of course, a nation of laws that come from the notion of both limited as well as representative government. So the writers of the Constitution were determined to create a government that was powerful enough to meet the nation's needs, but not so powerful as to threaten people's liberty. Accordingly, the Constitution is rooted in the idea of a government of restricted power. The Constitution provides for such a government, a government in multiple ways: denials of power, grants of power, the Bill of Rights, and of course the separation of power, which a lot of presidents these days don't like. These provisions have curbed, or sometimes have of course also failed to curb, extra constitutional uses of power. The other piece to this is representative government, something we are so proud of in the United States. We the people are the opening words of the US Constitution, and if you haven't read it, I encourage you to read it. It's a beautiful document. Yet the Constitution in its original form made only limited provisions for direct popular influence. The House of Representatives was the sole popularly elected institution, and voting eligibility was left to the states to decide. So that system was gradually altered, but substantial barriers to popular participation still remain, mainly in the form of state laws that restrict voting. It's fascinating to see the reasons that the framers felt it necessary to limit popular influence, how and why that original system has changed, and contemporary barriers that have come up: gerrymandering, voter registration, voter ID laws that inhibit voting. So moving on to another subject, federalism. So this is another very unique aspect of the US, and the writers of the Constitution created the first federal nation, one that divided sovereignty between a national government and a state government to bring about and reconcile the conflicts between national and state authority. And these continue to play out to this day for broadly worded constitutional clauses, partisan differences, and of course our changing national needs. All of these have combined to make federalism a source of both political conflict and change. And when we speak of change, synonymous with it is the nature of change in civil liberties. So under our Constitution, all of us individuals are guaranteed free expression and fair trial rights. So during our nation's history, these rights have been expanded in practice through action by the Supreme Court, and a key development has been their protection from action by state and local governments. And the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment's due process clause has been the basis for this change. So embracing these developments does help to explain the individual rights that we so enjoy. And major Supreme Court rulings, such as those relating to free speech, to protection from unreasonable search and seizure, also the need to be understood as a means of clarifying the nature of our civil liberties. So when we speak of civil liberties, we also speak of civil rights in the same breath. The right of every person to equal protection under the laws and proper access to opportunities. So although we in theory are equal in our rights, historically disadvantaged groups, including women, minorities, have had to struggle to attain a greater measure of equality. So I think we need many more policies instrumental in expanding the rights and opportunities of disadvantaged groups. The 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, 1964, yes, the 1964 Civil Rights Act, and affirmative action for starters were good, but they are not good enough. So when we are speaking about expanding rights, it's important to also discuss Congress, the Supreme Court, as well as policy issues next. So let me turn to Congress and constituency. The Congress was established as the first branch of government, we know that, and the institution that would represent the people. And interestingly, nothing looms larger in political thinking of most members of Congress than their constituency, the state or the district that they represent, a good thing. The nature of our electoral system, its single member plurality district system, compels them to pay attention to their constituents in order to win a re-election. So constituency affects the behavior of members of Congress and influences the types of bill that these members are more likely to support. Of course, Congress is also deeply linked with party and with its two chambers, numerous committees, and individually empowered members. Congress is a very fragmented institution. This said, there is a unifying force in Congress, its political parties, for Congress is organized along party lines. For instance, the majority party in each chamber chooses the top leaders and I guess holds a majority of seats on each standing committee. So in the past decade, as a result of widening ideological gap between Republican and Democratic lawmakers, partisanship has increasingly divided the actions of Congress. I think the role of parties in Congress explains the polarization that we now have. So while Congress is, and I guess it is precisely because Congress is a very fragmented structure, it makes it difficult for Congress to take the lead on major national issues, but it makes it perfectly suited for taking on scores of smaller issues at once. Let's now turn to judiciary and the Supreme Court. Article 3 of the Constitution establishes the federal judiciary and defines its authority. Of particular interest is the Supreme Court, a situation that derives from its status as an independent and co-equal branch of the federal government, and from the fact that America's system of divided powers and individual rights is a frequent source of constitutional disputes. So judicial power is pretty strong, and despite what one may say, politics does play a part in Supreme Court decisions, and that's why the fight to elect Supreme Court judges. I'm also going to bring up public opinion because it is a powerful and yet inexact influence on our elected officials. They risk their careers if they ignore it. Yet its influence is not easy to pinpoint, and there are many issues where public opinion doesn't come into play, so one needs to examine the attributes of public opinion and explore its impact on the decisions of lawmakers and policymakers. What's missing is a need to figure out the theory, science, statistics, and practice of polling, which has become the primary method of accessing public opinion, and of course poll ratings for political parties. On the subject of political parties are inseparable from democracy, not just here, anywhere in the world. So by offering a choice in between policies and leaders, parties give voters a chance to influence the direction of government. Unlike most democracies, we have a two-party system, the Republicans and the Democrats. Our elections too differ from those of virtually all other democracies in that they are longer, they are more costly, they're more clearly centered on the candidates rather than the political party itself. We saw it in the last election. It's important to be savvy about the invisible primary, and I'm sure we are getting into it soon, the period preceding the presidential primaries and the caucuses, the state nominating contests and the general election campaign, which of course centers on the battleground states. When we are speaking about political parties, we necessarily have to discuss political movements. So these are, in another way of putting it, social movements, a way for us citizens disenchanted with government to actively express disagreement. Unlike voting or lobbying, political movements take place outside established institutions, often in the form of protest demonstrations and rallies. Here we have a rich tradition that affects the success of political movements, such as the ability to attract the resources required for sustained advocacy. Something very unique to the US is the role interest groups play. An interest group or a special interest group, a faction, a pressure group, a lobbying group actively seeks to influence public policy. So in that sense, an interest group resembles political parties, but there is a key distinction between the two, a distinction that we need to be constantly aware of. Above all, parties are in the business of trying to influence elections. Groups, on the other hand, concentrate on influencing policies directly affecting their own interests. So one needs to empathize, though not necessarily agree with interest groups, group influence, and appreciate why some interest groups are more fully organized than others are. Let's turn to something that's been in the news media. The news media is a window into the world of politics, and for most of us, politics is a second-hand experience, something we observe through the media rather than directly. So many of our images of politics are derived from what we see and hear through the media. So media's influence on politics is huge, as someone I know says. The news system was once dominated by the television, broadcast networks, and local newspapers. Probably still is. But today, these have to compete with cable and internet outlets, social media, many of which operate by a very different standard. Let's now move into the last piece of this segment, which is the broad aspects of policy. And I think social policy is a good place to begin. So social issues dispute values and how we should live our lives, not from now, but from 5,000 years ago. So social issues end up pitting people against one another, which is the case today for immigration, charter schools, police practices, gun rights, legislation of marijuana, environmental protection, and discrimination of all kinds. So over the course of history, though thankfully mostly out of the US, no aspect of society has played more directly into social issues than religion. So social issues that arise out of differences in values, and we know religions are founded on values. So not surprisingly, the intersection of religion and politics has been a persistent source of conflict, though thankfully out of our country. So one needs an appreciation of the intersection of religion and politics historically and currently if we are to make sense of the changing world around us. And it's also important to make sense of issues that religion drives, such as abortion, same-sex marriage. And these have played out in ways that have aligned religious conservatives with the Republican Party, and of course religious liberals and quote-unquote seculars with the Democratic Party. The other aspect of policy is fiscal and monetary policy, something that you read every day on the pages of the Wall Street Journal. Since the Great Depression, our government has taken responsibility for promoting and sustaining economic growth and stability. And this effort takes the form of fiscal policy in government's taxing and spending, and monetary policy in government's efforts to control the money supply. So a lot of this is wonky stuff, but it's really not too hard to get a handle on what they are. what tools they involve, and the political divisions they create. In fact, I argue it's important for us to spend the time to sort of get a handle on some of these issues because they influence and affect us directly. The other aspect of policy is welfare and income policy. And few issues of politics are more contentious than those relating to welfare and income. Our individualistic culture, the federal system of government, have resulted in welfare policies that are distinct from virtually all other democracies. And recently, income policy has come to the forefront as a result of the widening gap between the income level of most Americans and that of the country's wealthier, richer individuals. So these developments, being able to relate them to both the nature of the economy and the nature of policy, as well as the structure and politics of welfare system, the tax system, is what makes the public space such a fascinating, such an interesting area. So I know we are running out of time, so let's conclude with regulatory policy. Since the 1930s, the government has been actively engaged in regulating the economy, intervening to promote economic efficiency, to promote and to protect the public from harmful business activity, etc., etc., etc. These days, a lot of discussion centers around regulatory situations such as restraint of trade, things that create inequity, moral hazard, and of course negative externalities which result when firms fail to pay the full costs of production activity. So grasping partisan divisions over regulatory policy and the basis for these divisions is important too, to make sense of an increasingly complex world. So I know we've been all over the place, but I guess that is the nature of public discourse these days. And it's important to see the interrelationships between many of these things that we briefly touched upon in order to both participate, to influence, and also enjoy the world that we live in. Thanks for listening in.